Podcast, 10K Senior Artisans Editor from Variety. And before we kick off this Q&A, the Filmmakers and United Artists Releasing would like to let you know that there are resources available if you or you know anyone that's been a victim of domestic violence and sexual assault. And the following resources are National Online Resource Center on Violence Against Women, ALIMA, and the National Sexual Assault Hotline, which is operated by RAIN. What a powerful, moving movie. Wow. Let's get this Q&A started. And without further ado, we have writer and director Sarah Polley, cinematographer Luc Montpellier, production designer Peter Cosco, costume designer Quita Alfred, and editor Christopher Donaldson and Rosalind Kalu, and Dede Gardner, who is the film's producer. Wow, congratulations to you all on the incredible film. I think everybody's going to need a moment, but Sarah, talk about, what drew you to the book and wanting to turn this into a movie and writing that, actually writing the script and then turning it into a movie.
I loved the questions that Miriam Toews asked in her book, Women Talking. I loved how huge they were and earth-shattering questions around faith and forgiveness, and I think democracy. I was fascinated by the idea of this conversation in which people are talking about how to break the world they're living in and remake a new one, and the momentousness of that, and also that they had to do it in community with people that they fundamentally disagreed with about very basic things. And that idea of what democracy can and should look like, as opposed to what I think we think of it, what we have as a very poor substitute for real democracy. And it's so interesting to me, the richness of that conversation, which people might actually change their minds and come to a way forward together.
Amazing. Dede, talk about Sarah being the perfect filmmaker for this film and the conversations that you had about the casting and bringing that all together.
Sure. Fran McDormand brought me the book and asked if I wanted to partner with her to make it into a movie. And our first and really only idea of the person to adapt it was Sarah. At the beginning of Miriam's book and of the film, it says it's an act of wild female imagination. And I remember thinking to myself when I saw stories we tell, this is unlike anything I've ever seen. And it's sort of jujitsu level imagination. And I'd wanted to work with Sarah for a long time. And as it happens, she had read the book, and she and Fran share a manager in Frank Frateroli. And so when we called to submit it, she called to say, I see that Dede and Fran have this book, and what are they doing with it? So it feels very guided in a way.
And Luc's cinematography is stunning. Every single frame in this film. Talk about this female empowerment, this journey that these women go on, and what you and Sarah discussed. I mean, you had a really long time. You can also talk about that, but how you were going to capture that and deliver Sarah's vision.
It was important to me, just on a human level, to witness this seismic shift that was happening in someone's life. And I know Sarah had always talked to me about wanting the photography to really accentuate that importance, and how we never wanted to be passive with it. We wanted to be engaged with it. We wanted to be like another character in the film. And to me, when especially when you read the novel, it takes place in one place. It's basically all about the discussion, and it would be so much easier to produce a film that kind of took a passive approach to it and became more observational. But I know that that's not what the intention was. There was a lot of attention put to making this a cinematic journey and experience. And to me, that's what the challenge was. And, that was what the challenge Sarah gave me, to kind of be in that mindset of the nuance of how do we accentuate the dialogue, highlight shifts, have moments where after we've experienced this very intense moment, an idea that the camera could be giving us a bit of a break by drifting outside. And it was just a really, interesting thing to try to crack as far as the language goes, and to not get in the way, but also not be passive, because it is ultimately a film and cinema, and when you adapt, it becomes almost a very new thing. So I was up for the challenge, and it was a great thing for us to be able to sit together day after day and just talk through every scene. And Sarah has very specific ideas of what she's trying to say, and is extremely communicative with that, but also confident enough to let us play and to kind of challenge ideas, so that we make sure when you're watching that it's the right thing.
And Peter, I mean, it's all about the location. Talk about finding the perfect location to film this.
Well, we looked at a bunch of. We started in, I guess, April, kind of going out looking at some different farms, and this one seemed to have all the elements that we needed, and it was nice too, because just where, like, the terrain, like there were some gently rolling hills in the background, and like some forests and stuff. It felt much more isolated than it actually was. I mean, it wasn't that far from Toronto, but the great thing was that we had a really great farmer that was a partner with us in this, and he allowed us to do all sorts of things. Like literally, like on a dime, he decided to change his crop from corn to soy to accommodate the film. He let us put roads there, because we basically used his farm to build a colony, and we put a network of dirt roads in there, and built some structures along the roads, and incorporated his barn and some other structures that he had there into our grand scheme.
But you have to tell the audience where that actual barn was.
Well, there were two barns. There was the barn on location that had a great shape, but wasn't quite conformed to the requirements that we needed for filming. So we built the interior in a stage, and then made some modifications to the barn on location to fit our set.
Amazing. And Quita, your costumes are incredible. The detail, the colors that you chose for each of them. Like, talk about the concept behind those.
Well, they were authentic Mennonite. I had the luxury of having help from actual Mennonite communities in getting the authenticity right. But we had such a limited, like, those ladies have such restrictions on all areas, in all areas of their life, but particularly in dress, and they do not have the luxury to be overdressed like I am. They have so little so few forms of expression. So we had to use fabric to give the slightest little bit of personality and expression to them. We had to, within Luc and Sarah's desaturated palette, we had to specifically choose. We first divided the families into the Friesen into moods, essentially. So the Friesens were a little bit more orderly and frenetic. Their colors were purer in my mind, and then eventually in reality. And whereas the Lowens became more mercurial, natural colors, swirling patterns, a little bit troubled. In my mind. And then the Jan's family, again, was the most constricted of all. And I had in my mind ideas of dried blood and rust and really old, unmoving ideas. So then we used what little we could by the way of pattern to express each of those intentions with the characters, because we couldn't add a frill, we couldn't put on an evening gown or anything. We had really just color and pattern to work with, and the restriction of those costumes, I think, I hope, allowed the actors to find ideas and go places that they needed to with their character, with being within such narrow parameters. I always make this gesture when I'm talking about these costumes, because the shape of them in reality, in culturally, is meant to negate the person wearing them. It's meant to make them disappear. It's meant to subjugate them and remind them of their place in the order of things. And so we used what few details we could to give the women expression and creativity is maybe not the right word I'm looking for right now, but to help them express themselves and help the actors express their characters.
Yeah. Christopher and Rosalind, talk about your collaboration as editors, and in those scenes, when the women are talking about, planning their escape, whether to go and not to go, like how you cut those, and when to put that cut, or when to like go with the long takes that you had from Sarah and Luc.
Sure. Chris and I actually met on a screening panel for Sarah's Stories We Tell, and I've been a big fan of his. He's a much sought-after editor, and they've worked great before in the past, but lucky for me, he was not available when we went to camera. So first step, we were there's a lot of work done around performance and getting the best moments, a rigorous combing through the footage specifically for performance and calibrating the performance of everyone in the room, because you have 10 characters in a 2-hour conversation in a single location with a lot of angles and a lot of varied performances. So that was quite a bit of work. And then when Chris came on board, he brought a very spectacular, fresh eyes and his great storytelling skills. I think in terms of the conversations on the initial passes, because the women were so good and they started to they gelled together and they had this really great camaraderie on set. And so that translated into the scenes, the ensemble scenes. And so a kind of rhythm started happening, even with the crew too. You could see where the crew settled in with the coverage. And so the cutting pattern initially on a first pass was you could just follow the rhythm of the acting. And then Sarah and Luc constructed specific long takes, which would stay, the monologues, there was no need to interrupt. The purpose was not to interrupt those and to let the emotion speak for itself.
Yeah, and you can kind of imagine what Roz and Sarah did with performance, like that many actors who are all amazing. Like there's no gimmies, there's no moment where you can say, oh, okay, we're not using that. You could have used anything at any time. And so as you're building the scenes and distilling the scenes, you want to try and keep everybody in the game at all times, like everybody in the loop, like cut to this person and then cut to this person so you feel the room. And then gradually it became clear that it actually was much more specific than that. That sometimes you just stayed with a person for a really long time and cut to one other person, as opposed to, and somehow in the minute specificity of that, it set more clearly what was happening in the entire loft. Somehow by being more specific and more singular, you had a greater sense of what was happening to the group. But obviously that's a long process of distillation.
Sarah, coming back to the story, there is hope and forgiveness at the end of that. Like, talk about writing that and balancing that in with everything, and how you got inside that mind so that they can, so you can have that hopeful ending.
I mean, the trick for me was I'm deeply interested in the idea of forgiveness, but the more I sort of dove into that idea and thought about it deeply, the more I realized forgiveness is something that has to be earned. And I think it's something that can't be impelled. And it's something that can only happen when harm has stopped. Otherwise, it begins to look like permission for the harm to continue. So it was really interesting sort of watching this group of people where forgiveness is such a central tenet of their faith, figure out how can you get to that in a just way? How can you get to that in a real way? And what it ultimately means is liberation from the harm they're experiencing. So I found the unpacking of that really interesting. And just finding those little moments between characters where they have to also forgive each other and themselves, you know, in terms of how they've absorbed these kind of methods of patriarchy and imposed them on each other and on themselves, and liberating themselves from that as well, to be a really fascinating thing to explore.
And, you know, it's a story of matriarchal society, right? On camera, but also behind the scenes. You had a lot of females, you know, you had a large female crew. Talk about what that was like on set. And Dede, you can jump in too with what that was like every day.
I mean, awesome, obviously. There were no rules. We wanted, I mean, we got the best. But we wanted, what we did talk about was people would get to go home at night and put their kids to bed and make them dinner, and that we would shoot 10-hour days, and that would allow for that, and that kids were welcome on set. We talked about that like years before, actually, and what would it like if we, since we are in charge to a degree, what if we made this like a deeply female family friendly, could we do this differently? Could we model it differently? And it turns out you can.
And it was amazing for me because I had stopped making films. I have 3 small children, and I didn't see how I could possibly be a present parent, or even a parent that existed while making a film, because, you know, I grew up on sets. They're, you know, a director, if they're doing their job correctly, probably works a 16 or 17-hour day, because you go home and do 3 hours of prep and you're in it, and the regular hours are 13, 14-hour days if you're lucky, and unsafe, actually, you know, for people to be driving home and managing big equipment. And so I had sort of dropped out, and I've seen actually a lot of women self-select out of directing and focus on screenwriting as a result of that. So to have Fran and Dede go, fine, we rewrite the rules. Like, men wrote the rules of the film industry. This is women talking. We're going to do it differently, was, for me, my entry back into making films.
We love it. Well, we hope that you make more films, and congratulations. Thank you for Women Talking. Thank you to this incredible panel, and thank you to the audience for that.
Thank you guys for coming.
Thank you so much.